Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy. Thank you for bearing with us. We've had some technical issues just resolved there a moment ago. Anyway, now I'm here for you with tonight's bulletin. Firstly, the Ukraine update for day 278. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed Russia will soon launch a series of new missile strikes on his country, warning his defence forces and citizens to prepare for the attack. He gave the ominous caution in his Sunday evening address. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains under Russian control. The Russia-installed administration of the occupied city of Indohar, home to the facility, has said. The announcement comes after the head of Ukraine's state-run nuclear energy firm suggested that there were signs that Russian forces might be preparing to leave the occupied plant. The Pentagon is considering a Boeing proposal to supply Ukraine with cheap, small precision bombs fitted onto abundantly available rockets, allowing Kyiv to strike far behind Russian lines. Russia and the US have ways to manage nuclear risks at the level of intelligence agencies. Chargée d'affaires of the US Embassy in Moscow, Elizabeth Rood, told Russia's state news agency RIA Novosti, adding that for now there were no meetings scheduled. Hundreds of Ukrainians fled Kherson city on Sunday as Russian shelling intensified. The liberation of Kherson earlier this month marked a major battlefield gain for Kyiv, but the population has struggled with a lack of water, heating and electricity. The UK will provide Brimstone 2 missiles, a precision-guided missile, to Ukraine as part of its latest package. Ukrainian authorities are gradually restoring power aided by the reconnection of the country's 4 nuclear plants, but millions of people are still without heat or electricity after the most devastating Russian airstrikes of the war. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's survival may depend on his value to Vladimir Putin as a future bargaining chip, his chief aide Leonid Volkov said when on a visit to London. So our next item is Chinese police have launched a show of force across the country in an effort to head off further protests against the government's rigid zero COVID policies. Since Friday, a wave of protests has spread across multiple cities, prompted by the death of 10 people in a building fire in Urumqi in Xinjiang. Much of the region had been under lockdown for more than 3 months, and people blamed the lockdown for the deaths. Gatherings held to protest or to mourn the victims were held in Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, and other major Chinese cities on Saturday and Sunday, as well as dozens of university campuses, with some police clashes and detentions in Shanghai. Protesters demanded an end to lockdowns, while some groups decried censorship and called for democracy and an end to the rule of Xi Jinping. Most protests were peaceful. There were some clashes with police in Shanghai, and protesters in Wuhan pushed over pandemic barriers. On Monday evening, authorities appeared determined to ensure there was no repeat. At a central Beijing subway station, dozens of police cars lined the streets and patrolled surrounding blocks, while uniformed and plain-clothed officers stood guard at station exits and stopped passers-by for questioning. Hours after the protest's scheduled start, which had been organised via encrypted messaging apps, there were few apparent participants. In Shanghai, authorities barricaded a street where protesters had gathered for the past 2 nights. A heavy police presence lined the city's middle Urumqi road, according to people nearby and footage shared online. Some small actions were held, according to observers sharing videos and photos online. According to a Twitter account that has been sharing protest material in recent days, a small group of people holding up blank sheets of paper in Kunming were later taken away by police. At Beijing's elite Tsinghua University, where large protests were held on Sunday, school authorities on Monday announced a student symposium on the pandemic and a free bus to help students get home early for the holidays. The announcement was greeted with some scepticism, given the term is not over yet. The extraordinary acts of civil disobedience, which observers have said are the most significant protests seen in China for decades, have demonstrated a growing frustration and scepticism with the ruling Communist Party's commitment to zero COVID. A series of incidents related to the enforcement of the policy, including a bus crash that killed 27 people being taken to quarantine, and numerous suicides and other deaths linked to lockdowns and restrictions, have tested people's tolerance. The widespread protests included prolific use of blank sheets of paper to represent dissident Chinese people are largely unable to safely express. In one shared video, apparently showing a crowd at Beijing's Liangma Bridge, a man clad in white says, "We'll always support the Communist Party, but we want democracy and freedom," as he holds up a blank piece of paper. Many protests have heard demands for democracy and rule of law, as well as press freedom and an end to online censorship. There have also been chants echoing the slogans displayed by the Beijing Sitong Bridge protester on the eve of last month's Communist Party Congress political meeting. For our next item, the UK government benefit sanctions. I'll start again. UK government benefit sanctions are forcing tens of thousands of families across Scotland into destitution, the SNP has warned, after figures revealed the amount clawed back by the DWP through sanctions. The figures, obtained by the SNP's Chris Stevens MP from the DWP, show that in August 2022 alone, the DWP took £2.3 million off claimants in Scotland at an average of £250 per sanctioned household. Mr Stevens, who represents Glasgow South West, said the approach highlighted the UK government's cruelty, warning UK social security policy undermined the positive work carried out by the Scottish Government. Commenting, Chris Stevens MP said, "These figures show the devastating impact of the Tory government's existing regime on people's ability to feed themselves and fend off destitution. If you look at the combined impact of this destitution tax alongside the poverty tax of deductions from universal credit, almost £2 billion a year is being taken from the poorest across these islands. The cruelty of the DWP under this Tory government is on full show, hammering and leaving households destitute through a cost of living crisis with unnecessary sanctions." He continued, "In Scotland, we've taken a much different, more progressive approach, opposing Westminster austerity by uprating benefits in line with inflation and increasing the Scottish child payment. Work the Tories would do well to learn from. The sad reality is, though, that all that work remains at risk and is ever undermined while we remain attached to the broken Westminster system at the mercy of the callous Conservative Party, demonstrating once again why Scotland desperately needs independence." Excuse me. The UK electricity network operator has cancelled plans to activate its emergency winter plan on Tuesday after steps were taken to allay concerns over power supplies. National Grid indicated this morning it could issue the requirement for consumers to start using its new demand flexibility service, which rewards businesses and households that shift their power usage away from times of peak demand. The network operator had given energy suppliers notice that it may deploy the scheme on Tuesday, but said it no longer planned to. It also issued an automated capacity mechanism warning, a reflection of when supplies are tight, which was cancelled within an hour. Such warnings are rare, but this was the second one in less than a week. Energy specialists had been concerned that Britain's power systems could be threatened by lower temperatures, which increased demand, still weather reducing wind power, and the slow return of a series of French nuclear reactors which have been out of action due to maintenance. But industry sources said a UK gas-fired power station stepped in to cover the need for extra supplies today. National Grid's flexibility scheme has been used in trials, but Tuesday would have represented the first time it has been used to reduce genuine pressure on the grid. Hundreds of thousands of households are eligible for the service, which formally launched this month after a trial with Octopus. However, it is limited to those with smart meters whose suppliers have signed up. So far, many of those who have registered are businesses or small domestic providers, although the two largest suppliers, British Gas and E.ON, have come on board. Gas and electricity prices soared on Monday morning after the Met Office issued yellow bad weather warnings over the weekend, and some forecasters suggested cold temperatures over Russia could hit the UK next month, in an echo of the beast from the east snowstorms that hit the UK in 2018. Ministers were criticised for not including gas-fired generation in a windfall tax announced this month. The UK government appears likely to allow new onshore wind projects in England after years of an effective ban, Business and Energy Secretary Grant Shapps has indicated, with ministers giving way in the face of a growing backbench Conservative rebellion. Mr Shapps said there would be more onshore wind projects where communities are in favour of it, which would mean the end of a de facto block on such projects since 2014 under planning rules. While Grant Shapps sought to present the idea as already proposed by Rishi Sunak, this is not the case. The U-turn instead appears to be a direct response to an amendment to a bill tabled by Simon Clarke, the former Levelling Up Secretary, which Labour is also expected to support. Clarke, one of a growing list of Tory MPs, including Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, to oppose a ban, has tabled an amendment to the Levelling Up Bill to allow new onshore wind projects in England. Asked about the issue, Shapps told Sky News, "We already have quite a lot of onshore wind. There will be more over time, particularly where communities are in favour of it." He continued, "That is, I think, the key test of onshore wind. Is it of benefits to communities locally? That has always been the principle for us, now for quite some time now." During the summer campaign to become Tory leader, where he lost to Liz Truss, Sunak released what he termed an energy independence plan, which stated, "In recognition of the distress and disruption that onshore wind farms can often cause, Rishi has also promised to scrap plans to relax the ban on onshore wind farms in England, providing certainty to rural communities." Clarke's amendment would oblige the government to change planning rules within 6 months to allow new projects. Both onshore and offshore wind power is a major element of the Scottish Government's net zero energy policy. INEOS, the chemicals company owned by the billionaire Sir Jim Ratcliffe, has held exploratory talks with Rolls-Royce on mini nuclear power reactors to provide electricity at Grangemouth refinery. A deal between INEOS, one of the UK's biggest privately owned companies, and FTSE 100 engineer Rolls-Royce is claimed to be a step towards helping INEOS in decarbonising the giant refinery, while also providing Rolls-Royce with a customer for its new nuclear technology. Rolls-Royce's main business is building and maintaining jet engines for commercial airplanes, as well as power systems for boats and land vehicles. However, it is hoping to use the expertise gained from building nuclear reactors for the UK's nuclear submarine fleet for use on land. INEOS, which produces fuel and the chemicals used in plastics, is planning to use hydrogen to power the Grangemouth plant, which employs about 2,000 people across nearly 700 hectares, that's about 1,700 acres of land. The Scottish Government is opposed to the development of any new nuclear power plants in Scotland, preferring to see the growth of clean renewable energy from wind and tidal power, which can then be used in the large-scale production of green hydrogen from seawater. The US government must drop its prosecution of the WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange because it is undermining press freedom, according to the media organisations that first helped him publish leaked diplomatic cables. 12 years ago today, The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, Der Spiegel and LP collaborated to release excerpts from 250,000 documents obtained by Assange in the Cablegate leak. The material, leaked to WikiLeaks by the then American soldier Chelsea Manning, exposed the inner workings of US diplomacy around the world. The editors and publishers of the media organizations that first published those revelations have come together to publicly oppose plans to charge Assange under a law designed to prosecute First World War spies. Publishing is not a crime, they said, saying the prosecution is a direct attack on media freedom. Assange has been held in Belmarsh Prison in South London since his arrest at the Ecuadorian Embassy in London in 2019. He had spent the previous 7 years living inside the diplomatic premises to avoid arrest after failing to surrender to a UK court on matters relating to a separate case. The then UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, approved Assange's extradition to the US in June, but his lawyers are appealing against this decision. Under Barack Obama's leadership, the US government indicated it would not prosecute Assange for the leak in 2010 because of the precedent it would set. The media outlets are now appealing to the administration of President Biden, who was vice president at the time, to drop the charges. Excuse me. Dozens of Iranian artists have called for an international boycott of cultural institutions run by or affiliated with the Islamic Republic in protest against the regime's worsening human rights abuses. The call by artists, writers, filmmakers and academics living in Iran and among its diaspora comes amid growing anti-government art activism by Iranians inside and outside the country after the death of 22-year-old Masha Amini. More than 6,000 Iranian culture figures have signed a statement in support of art students in the country who are facing arrest and intimidation for taking part in the protests, which began 10 weeks ago. The organisers of that letter have now published a plea for their peers around the world to boycott governmental institutions of the Islamic State of Iran and their covert affiliates and prevent them from having any presence in the international arenas of arts, culture and education. They condemned the increasingly brutal, violent and deadly state crackdown against anti-government protesters in which an estimated 300 people have been killed and 14,000 arrested. The group has called for direct action against arts organisations that take funding from the Iranian regime. The artist Junuz Tagizadeh, who took part in street protests in Tehran after Masha Amini's death and was tear-gassed, said some seemingly independent galleries have been the money-laundering arm of the government and have tried to depoliticize, Iranian artists. I support and expect international cultural institutions to boycott them, she said. Provoked by Masha Amini's death while in police custody following charges that she was wearing the hijab inappropriately, artists in Iran have created public installations that reflect the brutality of the regime. In October, an anonymous artist created Tehran sinking in blood by dyeing fountains in parks red. In response to a crackdown on demonstrators at Tehran's Sharif University, 2 anonymous female artists hung red nooses from trees in Danesju Park. Excuse me. Homeless people in Scotland will have the ability to settle and access support wherever they choose under legislation coming into force tomorrow. People can currently be asked to demonstrate their local connection to the area where they present as homeless. If they are unable to do so, councils can refer them to another area where they do have a local link, such as somewhere they or their family members have lived or worked. The new legislation suspends that power for Scottish local authorities, giving people freedom about where they settle and access services. It aims to help them integrate more fully into the local community and to reduce repeat homelessness. Housing Secretary Shona Robertson said, "Local connection requirements have been recognised as a barrier to accessing homelessness services, which is why we have chosen to remove them. Most people who are homeless want to live in a community where they are already settled, but this legislation allows them to move somewhere new if they want to, whether that's to access support, take advantage of job opportunities, or simply to have a fresh start. This puts rights for homeless households on a par with those for people who own or rent their homes, ensuring they have access to consistent services wherever they are in Scotland." She continued, "I know that there are housing pressures in some local authorities, but that ultimately they share our ambition of ending homelessness. This legislation will help ensure people can find a settled home as quickly as possible in an area of their choosing." Organisations who support people with problem drug use, are being invited to apply for funding to expand their residential rehabilitation provision. The Residential Rehabilitation Rapid Capacity Programme Fund is part of the additional £100 million announced as part of the national mission to improve access to residential rehabilitation, trebling the number of publicly funded places by 2026. Applications for this latest round of funding will close on the 9th of January 2023, with priority given to projects increasing services in areas where residential rehabilitation provision is lower, so people can access treatment regardless of where they live. Phoenix Futures was supported by the RRRCP to develop their National Families Service, Harper House in Saltcoats, which was opened by the First Minister on the 21st of November. Minister for Drugs Policy Angela Constance said, "I have always said I want every penny of the additional funds announced as part of the national mission to make a difference, and this fund is already having a positive impact on the lives of people with problem drug use. The opening of the Harper House, which can support up to 20 families at a time, and the recent expansion of detox and rehab services at the Lothian and Edinburgh Abstinence Programme, otherwise known as LEAP, are just a couple of examples of how this money is being used to increase the options available to people who want help. While there is much to be done to address our drug deaths crisis, these projects show we are making changes to support people to access the treatment and recovery that is right for them," she said. People across Scotland are being asked to consider if they could open their homes to displaced people from Ukraine as part of a new campaign to find new hosts. The campaign aims to increase the supply of volunteer hosts across the country for people who are currently in short-term welcome accommodation. A new webpage has been set up to provide prospective volunteers with clear information on the application process and what is expected should they be matched with a displaced person from Ukraine already in Scotland. Hosts will register their details online, which will then be sent to their local authority, where checks are undertaken to ensure that homes offered are suitable to host displaced people from Ukraine. Scotland is providing sanctuary to more displaced people per head of population than any other part of the UK. Since the conflict in Ukraine began, more than 21,500 people with a Scottish sponsor have arrived, representing more than 20% of all UK arrivals. Minister with special responsibility for refugees from Ukraine, Neil Gray, said, "I'm so proud of the warm welcome the people of Scotland have given to those fleeing the war in Ukraine. We have welcomed so many people through our super sponsor scheme who would otherwise not have been able to travel. We don't want people to spend any more time than necessary in temporary accommodation, and we are keen to match people with hosts as soon as we can. We need more hosts, and that's why we've launched this campaign. We know that being a host is a big commitment, so we have set out exactly what will be expected so people can make an informed choice before providing their details." The most successful arrangements happen when both the needs of hosts and Ukrainians align. Many people may prefer to live in areas close to amenities and services or close to pre-existing Ukrainian communities. In addition, volunteer hosts will have their own preferences and may not have space for larger family sizes or complex group compositions. Forgive me. Well, that is it for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland, here we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, then there's a bell at the top of the screen which you can click if you want to set up a reminder whenever there's a new show. Your next edition of Scotland at 7 tomorrow night will be hosted by Donald C. Stewart. So all it takes for me to do is to let you all get on with your evening. So I'll say good night and thank you for watching. Good night.